Alright, so this week we are going to be covering what is social psychology, and is it more like psychology or sociology? But before we get started, let's address some of the things that we started discussing last week, a few updates. So after looking at everybody's first activity, which I'm still grading right now, I'm about halfway through. Some of you will still be getting some comments, so please look at that. But in terms of those of you who had opinions, most of you said that you didn't care which option we chose, or you were fine with either as long as it were one of the apps. But in terms of those who had a very specific opinion on either iClicker or AttendMe, there were about 12 of you who chose iClicker and 7 who chose AttendMe. So I have heard that iClicker can be a bit glitchy, and some people have had some, just a few minor problems, and some have had some major problems with iClicker. So we'll just keep an eye on that. Let's go ahead and start with iClicker. I'll send out directions for how to do so, and let's try to start with that Wednesday. But if I do notice that there are some glitches, that the attendance isn't coming through, especially right now when that's so important, we will then move to AttendMe and give that a try. So just kind of keep that on the back burner. From what I know, as long as I'm just doing it for attendance, the iClicker app should be free for everyone and is available for both Apple and Android devices. So please let me know if you have any issues. But again, I'll send out directions on how we can proceed with iClicker. For the contingency plan, I would say obviously the vast majority of you all decided that you would prefer plan A, which is to go fully online if I can no longer teach or if I become sick at some point. So with that being said, there's a lot of bridges that we'll have to cross once we get there, since this is such an unusual circumstance. But if we do have to move online, that might be temporary, that might be for the rest of the semester. It really just depends at, one, obviously if it happens, but two, where I am, how I'm feeling, and at what point of the semester are we. If we're like halfway through, maybe we move it online for 2 weeks or something and then come back. It's really up to you guys, or we might move it online permanently. Have to see kind of what makes the most sense when we get there. But like I said, either way, whatever plan that we choose, it will only work to benefit you. And so there's some different ideas I've thought of, like, let's say I get diagnosed with COVID and I'm feeling okay. All right, so maybe I have somebody guest lecture for a week. And again, this also depends on which week it is and which section. So let's say I have somebody guest lecture, but I'm still running the class and grading everything. And then afterwards I come back, or we go online for a week. It really just depends. Like I said, it could be temporary, it could be permanent, but we'll address that when we get there. But what I see from what you guys want is that the vast majority of people do not want a different instructor, which totally makes sense. That would be really stressful, kind of adapting to a different teaching style and maybe even different grading style. So regardless, I will stay the instructor. We will most likely move online. I would imagine that it would be on a more permanent basis, but again, we'll address that when we get there. So I will make sure that that plan is made clear to my department and the university, that the contingency plan for if I get sick is that by all means, we want to do everything we can to make sure that I'm still in charge of the course and that I'm still doing the grading and moderating and so on. So what that might look like is basically what those who are attending the class virtually right now are doing. So I will just record the lectures. Maybe if we go fully online, I will actually record myself doing the lectures, but again, we'll kind of see how that goes, or if that's necessary. But you would just listen to or watch the lectures online and then do everything as the syllabus currently states. So like, it should be a very easy transition for us to move online. So I'll just post everything at the same times as I'm currently doing. Everything will just be online. So That, of course, would mean that since you can't access the class in person, everyone then would need to turn in an outline. And again, for those of you who've already done it, and I know it was a bit difficult because of, the first week there's not a whole lot to cover, but it's not particularly long. Again, it's just to make sure that you're covering the main points, that you're accessing that material, and that you have an opportunity to ask me questions. And for those who have already completed outlines, I've responded to your questions, and I think that's really helpful to kind of keep you in the loop and make sure that you're not misunderstanding something, or you get to talk about something that you think is interesting, get additional resources. If you're like, hey, I really like this topic, I want to know more, I can recommend some readings or some videos and all that good stuff. So that also goes for if the university decides to shut down. As I'm sure many of you already know, Stillwater Public Schools have shut down and gone online. And so if the university decides to do that, which I'm really not sure, to me it seems like they really don't want to. However, that could certainly be the case. And if the university goes online, again, it's the same thing. It should be a very easy transition to online. And instead of coming to lectures in person, you will just access them virtually. And so one thing that I want to make sure everyone is aware of is, one, again, please wear your masks in class. Please wear them appropriately, regardless of how you feel about them. We have to make sure that we all are safe, we all feel safe, and we're all being respectful to each other. So please wear your masks in class. Please do your best to distance from others. But also, if you or someone you know tests positive, please go get tested. That's number one, most important. But some things that I'm not sure that the university is necessarily making clear is that when you test, of course, test in Payne County, but ideally you would get your test, not a rapid test. Those are not great. They're not, honestly, none of the tests are perfect. They can't be, especially if you're not symptomatic. But go get the nasal swab, ideally, on campus, and make sure that you put your current Stillwater address. Please do, I understand you want to put your permanent address, like where you're from, but make sure that you put your current address so that it is counted for here in Stillwater. That also helps for contact tracing, and so that we're aware, the university is aware, I'm aware, and all that good stuff, and so that they can plan accordingly. Another thing that I want to address with y'all, and this is something that I will discuss in the next lecture. For those of you who are accessing this online, I will put this in the next lecture because it's something we're going to discuss in class on what should I do if a student tests positive. Because I can't break FERPA and say that, hey, another student in here has tested positive, right? We don't want to ostracize anybody or make it known, right? I can't make their medical history known. Of course, I would like for you guys to tell me so that I'm aware that you're not well and so that I can make accommodations for you as an instructor. But of course, I want to protect your identity and your confidentiality, especially in terms of your medical records, and kind of what's going on with that. So I just want you all to know that there is that possibility. I'm not necessarily, you might be contacted by the university, but it's not something that I can contact you about and tell you that, hey, someone who's sitting next to you tested positive. So that's something that I want us all to kind of think about and be aware of so that we're all fully informed when we enter the classroom. And then moving on to the seating chart, I tried to take into consideration everyone's preferences, it was difficult. And of course, I kind of wanted to know, not only your preferences of where to sit, but also how often you plan on coming to class, which is fine if you decide that you can't come to class often. That's up to you. These are very special circumstances, and I understand that we all have a lot of different things going on in our lives. So how the prioritization went is I wanted to make sure that people who wanted to sit near the exit for whatever reason could sit closer to the exit. For those who wanted to sit in front of the projector, that you were able to sit where you had a good view of the projector. And then for those of you who wanted to sit closer to the podium, I wanted to make sure that you were as close to the podium, or at least on the side of the room with the podium, that you had a clear view of me so that you could see and hear what I'm doing a little bit better. And then from that, I looked at how often you planned on attending class. But for the most part, everybody's preferences, I was able to accommodate everyone's preferences. Not always you sitting next to a friend that you wanted to. For the most part, everyone is sitting near the person they wanted to sit next to. But for a few of you, that wasn't, once I looked into everyone's preferences, it didn't really seem like you were going to end up being in a similar location in the room. So if you have any issues with where you're sitting, I have a few open seats where you can be moved. So just try it out for this week and just let me know if you're having any issues. And if you are, we can move you around, we can figure it out. But for now, this is the most up-to-date permanent seating chart. And then of course, this is for those of you in person, but I'll go ahead and say it. The videos will now be uploaded onto Canvas and YouTube starting today. I would like to say that I am still working on the audio. I know it is not great. There's certainly a bit of an echo and a hum. Still working on that, still waiting on getting some equipment to make it a bit better, so you're getting a higher quality product and not, something that you're constantly hearing a bit of an echo or a buzz, because I know that is really can be difficult to listen to. So I'm still working on that, but hopefully by the end of this week, everything will be good to go. But be looking to the YouTube channel and Canvas for all of the lectures. So that took a while, but we'll move through the rest of this. So again, what is social psychology and what does it have to do with sociology? So I assume many of you have heard of the case of Kitty Genovese. And as the story goes, she was murdered one night in 1964 with 37 to 38 witnesses. And yet nobody helped or even called the police until it was too late. Reports of this event sparked research on what came to be known as the bystander effect. But despite what you'd think, it says that sometimes people are less likely to help if there are other people around. But the bystander effect isn't as simple as more people equals worse odds of getting help. Sometimes more is better, and there are other factors that matter too. And so right here in this slide, we see that this is actually a headline from the New York Times. And it says, 37 who saw murder didn't call police. And people were terrified, they were appalled. How could this have happened? This brutal murder, people could hear it. Why is it that, as it says here, respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks? People were like, why is this? Why is it that nobody asked for help? And so again, research started on what is now known as the bystander effect. And right here, I just have a screen grab of that first publication on the bystander effect. And it was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 1968. And what's interesting is this first study, the researchers created a similar situation in the lab. They used 72 undergraduates who came in thinking that they were doing a study on something else, that they were going to talk about common issues that undergraduates face. And so they were either in a room alone with one other person, 2 other people, or 5 people. And one of the people who were in the room, which in an experiment you would call a confederate, so one of the participants who was really in on it, pretended to have a medical emergency. And the researchers then would start the clock and time how long it took for each participant to ask for help. What they found is that alone, 85% asked for assistance. But in a group, in fact, the largest group of 5 other people in the room, only 31% asked for assistance. And so, of course, like most people were concerned about this person who's having a medical emergency, but they didn't know if they should get help or not. As a result, the bystander effect was born. And of course, lots of research has confirmed it since then, but it isn't as straightforward as it may appear. Some people are actually more likely to help, and that may be because They are trained medical professionals. They know what to do in the situation, so they will automatically react. Others, of course, don't have that experience. So one of the biggest factors here are the bystanders themselves. So what occupation do they hold? What sorts of experiences do they have? And we're not necessarily talking about psychological characteristics, like maybe this person's temperament, how willing they are to take risks or to take action. This is more so looking at those factors, like, again, their occupation and their experiences. And that certainly plays a huge role in whether or not they're willing to act. Another big factor here is commitment, and which we will talk about here in a little bit. But other studies suggest that responses to a situation like this have to do with a couple of things. Commitment being one, social influence, meaning that when you aren't sure what's going on, you're going to look around and take cues from the people around you and react accordingly. If other people don't see it as a big deal, you might not see it as a big deal either. You might be concerned about being judged negatively if you do make something a big deal that nobody else seems to be concerned with. Another is the diffusion of responsibility. And so when something happens when you're in a big group, it isn't only up to you to help. Other people could help too. So you don't feel as responsible to act. So when it comes to commitment, there was a study, I believe it was in France in 2015. And what they did is they had someone like at a bus stop, and they had a backpack, and they would look over to somebody else, and they would say a few different things. One, they might say nothing at all, and they just walk away to an ATM and leave their backpack there. They might point to one person and say, hey, would you mind keeping an eye on my backpack and make sure that nobody takes it? I'm just going to go to the ATM. I'll be right back. Or they could just kind of say generally to the group, like, hey, will you all keep an eye on my backpack? I'll be right back. And so what they found is that the people who were most likely to act were those who were asked directly. So they had more of a sense of responsibility and commitment. Like, just me, I am in charge of watching this person's backpack. However, if it were just kind of in the group and the person said it generally, people might be less likely to respond if somebody takes that person's backpack. And that's, again, that diffusion of responsibility. It's not just up to you. And that social influence, because if it's not just up to you and you look around and nobody else seems to be too worried about it, you might say, oh, okay, so this isn't really that big of a deal. Oh well. But also there are situations where people aren't really sure whether or not they need to act. Going back to this original study, there's people who are concerned that this other person is having a medical emergency, but one, maybe they're not necessarily sure if it's something that they need to respond to. Or maybe they're like, hey, I'm in a lab right now. Surely somebody else is watching or paying attention or something. But again, it's the nature of the situation and the people involved. One thing we do know is that if it's a clear emergency, people are actually more likely to step up, particularly when they're in a group. And that's because when you're in a group, and like, let's say someone who's committing like a violent crime is still there on site. When you have more people to back you up, it's actually a lot safer. And so people are more likely to step up in situations that are clear emergencies, even when there's a lot of people present. So ultimately, there are a lot of social and psychological factors at play here. And even the original story, going back to that with Kitty Genovese, it wasn't as clear-cut as the New York Times made it seem. Like, actually, many people, while they did hear something, it wasn't a clear sound of someone screaming, or they heard someone scream, but it was only once and it was faint. And so, in other words, it was ambiguous. And some people most people didn't really see much. It was very dark outside. It wasn't, it was kind of an enclosed space. It wasn't out right in the open where people can just see out and see that someone is being attacked. So again, it was very ambiguous. And even though the details have faded over time, it is good that we have researchers studying this phenomenon to make sure it doesn't happen again. But what does sociology have to do with social psychology? Again, coming back to this question. And how might sociological social psychology examine the Kitty Genovese case? So it's important to note that sociological social psychology is different from psychological social psychology. While many of the studies on the bystander effect from the psychological side of social psychology, the sociological side has a lot to offer as well. The factors contributing to the bystander not reacting, like social influence, commitment, diffusion of responsibility, whether or not the situation was ambiguous, and so on. Instead of looking at how those individual factors influence individual decision-making, sociologists might be more interested in the structural factors that influence whether or not bystanders act in a given situation. For a moment, I want you to think to yourself, and you can pause the video here. I want you to think to yourself and make a list of what are some examples of structural factors that might influence whether or not bystanders respond to a situation. Okay, so addressing some of those structural factors that might influence whether or not a bystander reacts in a given situation. And again, sociologists aren't necessarily always concerned with structure. But as a general example, some of the structural factors that we might be interested in, instead of looking at individuals, maybe, again, like the individual's personality or willingness to act or willingness to take risks, we're not looking at that. We might be more interested in whether or not the neighbors know each other. Do they feel some sort of bond to their neighbors and some responsibility to act? What's the crime history in the neighborhood? Is it a neighborhood that's a bit more dangerous? And people are concerned. They don't necessarily feel comfortable getting involved in things that are happening, particularly at night when it's dark. Whether or not people want to get involved, or do they not feel comfortable getting involved at some sort of conflict at night? Whether or not they think anybody will come if they ask for help. Are there street lights in the area? Can people see clearly? Can they see outside and see what's going on in case of an emergency? Are their windows covered? Do they have a lot of windows where they can look at different parts of the street or yards or wherever this is occurring? And what are the age of the residents? Is it an area where there's a lot of older folks or a lot of people with young children? That may certainly influence people's willingness to engage in a potentially dangerous situation. What are the occupation of residents? Again, is there a doctor in the neighborhood? In the case of Kitty Genovese, is there someone who's in law enforcement or was in the military or is a bodyguard or whatever the case may be? Is there somebody who might feel comfortable intervening if the situation got physical? And whether or not many of the residents work night shifts or early in the morning. So depending on when this occurs, let's say Kitty Genovese, that was happening at night, are there people who have to get up really early to go to work? Are there people who aren't home right now because they're working the night shift? That's important to consider. And those are all just some examples of structural factors that might influence whether or not people are willing to participate or act in a situation such as this. So the distinction between psychology and sociology is a bit murky, to say the least. But you'll often hear that psychology is a study of individuals, while sociology is a study of groups. And while this is true to an extent, it leaves out a lot of nuance. Psychology can be interested in groups, and sociology can be interested in individuals. It's just that psychologists are more interested in those internal processes that cause people to act, and sociologists are more interested in those external factors that cause people to act. In fact, social psychology is interested in all of these factors: the mind, what we call the self, culture, social structure, and social action. And below you'll see some examples of subtopics in each of those areas. And a lot of these we will cover throughout the semester. So in sociology, it is a branch that emphasizes the interrelation of the mind, self, culture, social structure, and social action. In the early days of sociology, researchers felt compelled to justify the existence of sociology as a separate academic discipline that are fundamentally different, that sociological concerns are different and distinct from those of psychology. These same issues arose as social psychology was emerging as its own area of focus. As it developed, three distinct domains of social psychology became apparent. Especially in the early days of the discipline, social psychologists were accused of not being sufficiently sociological. But before we delve into the three areas of social psychology, let's first make sure we are all clear on the differences between their parent disciplines. So what's the difference? Psychology's primary focus is the mind, whereas sociology is on society. And psychology focuses, again, on those internal mental or emotional states. Sociology focuses on how society shapes and is shaped by groups of individuals who are part of larger groups. In psychology, the view of the individual is that individuals are unique, sentient beings that are responsible for their behavior, and that their behavior is the direct result of cognition. In sociology, the view of the individual is that individuals are situated in a broader social context. They are located somewhere in the social order, or hierarchy of socialized roles, identities, and all of these are shaped by the historical social context. In this case, individual behavior is group behavior. Because individuals do not exist in a vacuum, they take on the roles, norms, values, behaviors, and practices of the groups they are a part of. In the most basic and oversimplified, and I cannot emphasize that enough, oversimplified sense, psychology might focus more on nature, whereas sociology might focus more on nurture. Or rather, how I like to look at it is sociology, that locus of control is internal, whereas in sociology, the locus of control is external. How this relates to each form of social psychology is that each discipline provides that very specific foundation, which we'll get into. But it's important to note that there is one area of social psychology that is primarily influenced by psychology, and the other two areas are influenced by sociology. However, those two areas are grouped into one discipline called sociological psychology. The psychology version is simply psychological social psychology, and they're very similar, especially at face value. But once you kind of get into the nitty-gritty and you start seeing the differences between sociology and psychology, you begin to see that they actually are quite distinct as disciplines. So some research questions that let's compare and contrast between psychology and sociology. When we look at psychology, again, the individual is singular and unique. In sociology, the individual is situated in society. So some differences might be. Let's do an example of research questions. Psychology might ask, what is the effect of a child's temperament on the child's reading ability? Sociology might say, what is the effect of social class on the reading ability of children? So for example, let's say I collected the reading test scores of 1,000 children living in Oklahoma City. All I know about them is their test score and their social class. So working class, middle class, upper middle class, and so on. Let's say I make three to four different stacks representing each social class. So it's all their test scores, and I've organized them by social class. When I calculate the average of each stack, I notice that reading scores decline about 10 points on average as I move down the class ladder. From this, I can say, social class may have some sort of effect on reading test scores. And of course, there are other factors like parents' education, how much time parents have to work with kids, the quality of the school, and maybe gender even, and so on. But because of all of these other factors that are more specific to the individual, like temperament, for example, or their home lives, I cannot look at a classroom of children and predict their individual scores based off of their social class. This is something that is important to note about sociology. We cannot make predictions, at least not in the same way psychologists can, and vice versa. A psychologist might go into a classroom and predict individual kids' test scores in relation to their peers, based off of their individual temperaments, again, for example. But a sociologist can't do that. Instead, I might say, look, I can't tell you how each of your 30 students is going to score on their reading test, but I can tell you that when we look at nationwide outcomes, you will see that, on average, kids in lower social classes make lower test scores than kids in higher social classes. And this is something we'll discuss more Wednesday in the difference here and how sociologists look at these broad patterns across society. But at any rate, so you might now think, okay, so social class is what causes these higher or lower reading scores. Well, no, not necessarily. We think of social class as more of a proxy for what sorts of experiences a person has or the quality and quantity of resources they have access to. For example, kids whose parents work a lot don't have time to take their kids to a tutor or work with them on their homework, or at least as much time. They might even live in an apartment where there are loud neighbors that keep kids up late at night. Or perhaps they don't have the resources to eat breakfast every morning, and so they go to school hungry and they can't focus as well on their studies. Or maybe everything is going well, and their parents do work with them. They get plenty of quality sleep, and they eat a healthy breakfast each morning. But the parents of higher class children have the resources to give their kids an extra boost by taking them to special tutors, put more of an emphasis on reading as opposed to other activities, and so on. Either way, social class can't tell us exactly why kids in lower social classes score lower on average on reading tests, but it can tell us that whatever resources, beliefs, experiences, and behaviors are associated with each social class actually have an effect on how well children can read, or more specifically, how well children can score on a particular test, which we'll talk more about in the semester. And so, before we go today, I want you to start thinking about the three, what we call faces, the three faces of social psychology. There's the psychological social psychology, the symbolic interactionism, and sociological psychology. The first, psychological social psychology, is the psychological discipline. The other two, symbolic interactionism and sociological psychology, are grouped together and typically referred to as sociological social psychology. The psychological version is a discipline in psychology, and it focuses on psychological processes in relation to social stimuli. Symbolic interactionism, on the other hand, is a sociological variant of psychological social psychology, which focuses on those face-to-face social interactions. And sociological psychology is another variant which relates macrosocial phenomena to individuals' psychological attributes and behaviors, which again we will delve more into Wednesday. And so for right now, that's all for today. Don't forget to complete the readings and watch the supplementary videos that I've posted. And please submit your assignment for this week. You have a quiz due this Friday. I highly recommend making sure that you complete the readings and watch the videos, as well as listening to both lectures before completing the quiz. Again, our next lecture is Wednesday. You will have plenty of time to complete the quiz by Friday. So even though I know some of you want to work ahead, I highly recommend making sure that you've seen both lectures before completing the quiz, because I drew information from the readings as well as from the lectures. The supplementary videos are just there to help you maybe better understand a topic that you weren't necessarily clear about when leaving the classroom, or something that you read in the short reading and you're still not really clear on. So for now, this is where we're going to go ahead and stop. Again, please take your quiz, start on the reading, And Wednesday we'll get into a bit more detail on the differences between psychology and sociology, as well as those three distinct phases of social psychology. But other than that, I hope you all have a good week, and I hope to see you Wednesday. Thank you.